Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 23. 2 Samuel chapter 23. Beginning at verse 8, we discussed the first 7 verses. There you go, David's mighty men. I found that. Thought that was a nice little slide there. Beginning at verse 8, we began last week because at verse 8, David begins to talk about his mighty men. And we know that the world has created its own fantasy illusion of brave, mighty, tough, and successful men. We watch them on different shows. We've seen, movie stars throughout the years, Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, Bruce Willis, all those that just seem to take an unreasonable and unending pounding, and then suddenly, they're able to get up and then run 2 miles or something like that. Of course, all of that stuff is Hollywood. But the scriptures contain real biographies of true characters, not Hollywood, not made up. Guys that don't have a lot of makeup and stuff on, but men who actually fight real battles. They kill lots of men, and God blesses them to be able to tell their kids and their grandkids about it. And we have a list of a lot of those men in verses 8 through 39 of chapter 23 of the 2 Samuel. Now, why this chapter is here, we'll address when we get to the end of our lesson tonight. But the scriptures do contain real biographies, and these are real men. These are not fake men. These are not stunt doubles necessarily. These are real guys. David gathered and organized what I believe is the most elite and successful fighting force of men in history. And I did a little search. I searched mighty men of valor or David's mighty men, and you don't get what you get are websites that talk about Greece, how Greece fought bravely in their history, and they did fight bravely in history. But I think most of the people that you look at or you look for, if you do a search with this kinds of things, you're not going to get much because the world at large doesn't believe. First of all, that the Bible is true, and it certainly doesn't believe that some man in the Israelite army killed 300 Philistines by swinging a spear or holding his sword. They don't believe that, and so they don't, even though there's more evidence, archaeological evidence, manuscript evidence, there's more evidence for these things that you see here actually being true compared to a lot of things that happened in ancient Greece. There's more evidence for this. The world doesn't believe this, and they will believe those other things. Just by way of example, we have, I believe it's over 5,000, I think it's 5,300 and something manuscripts of the New Testament, pieces of manuscripts of the New Testament. Not all of them are complete, but we have over 5,300 pieces of manuscripts of the New Testament. Do you know how many we have of Homer's Iliad? I think less than 100, way less than 100 manuscript pieces from Homer's Iliad. And yet it's supposed to be this great and wonderful thing, and you read it and everything, and nobody believes the New Testament. It's not inspired, it's not true, it's written by man, all these other kind of things. That's just the world. That's just the way the world thinks. That's the way the world looks at things. Bottom line, they do not believe in inspiration. When you do not believe in inspiration, everything is subject to man. Everything is subject to the whims of man and the thoughts and the ideas of man. And that's the case here. But I do believe David gathered and organized the most elite, successful fighting men in history. These men were real, they were courageous, they were skilled, and they were immensely blessed by God. God blessed David in unprecedented ways, and these men were one means that God employed to bless David, to be that blessing to David. They protected him, they defended Israel's borders, they expanded Israel's borders, which of course is pleasing to God because God has given them all of this land anyway. It's God's, it's Israel's. And so when the borders expand, There's nothing wrong with that. We mentioned last week 1 Chronicles chapter 11 and verses 10 through 47, which is a parallel to 2 Samuel 23. You'll have a list of men. There'll be some names that are spelled different, and that's common. But you have one of the statements in verse 10 in 1 Chronicles, which is very interesting, why these men existed and what did they do necessarily. Verse 10 in 1 Chronicles 11 says, these men gave him, that is David, strong support in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. So these men were blessed by God. These men understood that David was called by God to be the king. They recognized that, and they worked to ensure that he stayed on the throne, that he got there, and then that he stayed there. They protected him. So these strong men, a gallery of heroes, consisted of three chief men. Verses 8 through 17, we looked at that last week. Verses 8 through 17, there were three guys that were at the top. Three chief men that were at the top. There were two others who were a second rank, and that's in verses 18 through 23. And then there are at least 31 in the longest part of the list. The longest part of the list is in verse 24 through 39. So some men of secondary rank, verses 18 through 23. And what we looked at last week, we got all the way down to verse 19. And so we're going to begin at verse 20 here in just a moment. But that's the way it breaks down. You have three chief guys, verses 8 through 17. You have men, two others of a second rank, 18 through 23. And then at least 31 people in the longest list in verses 24 through 39. And the list of the names indicates that David had organized this special group of men very early in his public career, because you see in verse 24 that the name Asahel was killed by Abner short time before David became king over the northern and southern tribes. So this list was not put together lately. This list has been, and men have been part of this for a long time, even before David became king over all of Israel, because Asahel is part of it, part of the list in verse 4. So there is one note of curiosity that I brought out last week, and that is that Joab is specifically not called a great warrior, which is interesting because he was the commander of David's army. Abner was the commander of Saul's army, or Mephibosheth's army, after Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle. But Joab is nowhere specifically called a great warrior in this section. Among the two Old Testament lists of David's mighty men here in 1 Chronicles, Joab is nowhere to be found. Now, Joab's two brothers were mentioned, Abishai and Asahel. Joab's armor bearer was mentioned, but Joab was not. And as a point of curiosity, why was he not mentioned? My guess is that it's because he murdered these three men. He murdered Abner, he murdered Absalom, and he murdered Amasa. Joab was a man, it appears to be a man who was not to be trusted. In his thinking, he was devoted to David, he was defending David, but he was defending David unethically by getting rid of these men. Amasa, was killed because David had appointed Amasa over David's army in place of Joab. And there was a little bit of a coup within the military ranks there. And shortly after David's death, Absalom dealt with Joab based upon David's own wisdom to him. You need to deal with Joab. This is the first thing you need to do. You shouldn't let some of his actions carry over into yours. You need to start from a real fresh slate. Start good here. Deal with Joab. And that's what he did. And we'll see that when we're going to look at 1 Kings 1 and 2 to finish up on David's life. But that is a note of curiosity, and my guess is that Joab is not specifically called a great warrior in these two lists because of what he did. Because of what he did and the way he acted with these three men. So we looked through verses 8 through 12, and then we began to look through verses 13 through 17. There is not a lot about these men at all. I have lots of Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias and things like that, and I looked through everything I could find to find anything I could on these guys. What Scripture says about them, what archaeology has found out about them, if anything. There's just not a lot there. We have no reason to think that they did not exist because it's Scripture. Scripture's inspired. These men are real. We have that conviction because it is the Word of God, but there's just not a lot written about them. I wish there was. It would be interesting. It would be a great study. They're not perfect, so some of the things I'm sure that we would learn if there was more details is that they're not perfect, and we would learn the ways in which they are not perfect. But the Lord chose not to add any more information other than their name and a few details about them. A few of them, not all of them, have those details. So let's look at verse 20 through 23 and deal with that section, and then we'll look at verses 24 and following and make some comments and then wrap this chapter up. Verse 20, then Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kavzeel, who had done mighty deeds, killed the two sons of Ariel of Moab. He also went down and killed a lion in the middle of a pit on a snowy day. He killed an Egyptian, an impressive man. Now the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with a club and snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, did, and had a name as well as the three mighty men. That's the three top guys. He had a name as well as the three mighty men. He was honored among the 30, but he did not attain to the three. And David appointed him guard over his guard. So over his palace guard, you'll find this man, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over his palace guard. So, throughout the long career of David, there were two things in which he could cheer about and find comfort in, and that was the unchanging faithfulness of his God. He knew that God would remain faithful. He trusted God at his word, but he also was granted loving devotion of his servants. And these men right here, of course, are some of his servants. And they loved David and they devoted themselves to him, and it was a great comfort to David. Just as when you find a true friend, when you find one whose character is in the pursuit of holiness and whose desire is excellence in everything that they do, then you have found a true friend. And David found these men to be true friends and a great comfort to him. They enjoyed being around David. David enjoyed being around them. A great man will attract great men, and David was a great man of God, and he attracted men. He attracted great men. A great man knows where he is going, and he knows why he is going, and who has called him to go. A great man knows this. Great men intuitively know a leader, and they want to follow him. That's why some great leaders in church history attract men, and people want to go and sit down at their feet and listen to them and be around them and be an encouragement to them and be a help to them. God just grants that men intuitively know a leader and they want to follow him. And I'll show you an example here in chapter 21, just a couple of pages back. In chapter 21 and verse 17 of 2 Samuel, so it's just a couple of pages back. Chapter 21 and verse 17. I'll begin reading at verse 15. When the Philistines were at war with David, this is recounting some history here. David went down and his servants with him, and as they fought against the Philistines, David became weary. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giant, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, You shall not go out again with us to battle, so that you do not extinguish the lamp of Israel. Now that's a statement. What he says there is, you are the lamp of Israel. You are the king. You are the one blessed. You are the one that has been the center around which all of these men gather. We defend you. You are God's king, God's anointed. The last place you need to be is out here in the middle of the battlefield, risking injury or death. That's the devotion that you see to David. That's these men would rally around him and they would protect him. Evidently, this was a close call, as we say. So Abishai says to him, and perhaps at this time, David is a little bit up in years. He's older than these younger guys, and he's weary, or maybe he, for whatever reason, he hasn't fought in a battle recently, but for whatever reason, he grows weary on the battlefield and almost is killed. But the point of showing you that was to show you the devotion of David's men. Great men intuitively know a leader and want to follow him. And that's the way it was with these guys. A leader's confidence is contagious. He draws out of others. A leader will draw out of others a commitment to excellence. And that's what David was. And there are men that you probably know throughout church history that have drawn people to them because they desire excellence. They desire to be around people with excellence. And I think you're the same way. You don't like to necessarily be around people that are lazy and the people that, oh, okay, that's fine. You don't have to really go to that extent. People who are okay with just the status quo, there are enough of those people. I don't want status quo people. I want people striving for excellence that will say, that's good, but it's not good enough. We could do it better. That's what a leader draws out of people. A leader motivates those around him to be their best at all that they do. And David had this kind of impact on those around him because he was a man after God's own heart. At the center, of course, of all of this is David's desire to please his Lord, David's desire to see his God's name be exalted and vindicated in everything that he does. And it was contagious. And he drew out of other men excellence. He drew out of other men a high level of commitment. And David loved these men, and these men loved him. Of course, God, all of this is God's blessings in David's life. But as we look at this man here, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, he's a man of similar military aptitude as these other guys. In fact, it says he was as good as the three upper guys. The three ones that we talked about in verses 8 through 17. He was that good. He was the son of a Levitical priest from the southern city in Judah called Kavzael. Technically, it's Kavzael. That's how you say it. But he was from Judah. There's a southern city there. There's a unique display of courage on his part. One to which David could somewhat relate because David was overwhelmed, of course, in his battle with Goliath. Involved also, he could relate because it involved going down into a pit or a cistern. How does he say here? He went down and killed a lion in the middle of a pit. That's a cistern. Evidently, there was something dug out that caught rainwater, and probably what happened was a lion fell down in it, or was in it, somehow got down through there, and for whatever reason, he went down and killed this lion that was in this pit. And of course, David, in 1 Samuel 17, David relates the story how he killed a lion. He's faced overwhelming odds, and he did this in protecting the sheep. Apparently, this wild animal, as we said here, had accidentally fallen into this tank used for drinking water. You might wonder, couldn't they put a log or something down there and so that the lion would be able to get out? And for whatever reason, they did not do that. And this is to demonstrate Benaiah's strength here. But what he does is he encounters Israel's enemies, including confronting and killing two of Moab's best men, it says. Two of Moab's, the two sons of Ariel of Moab. We don't know their names. We don't know anything about them. But it says that they were Moab's best men, as well as striking down an Egyptian. Verse 21, he says, an impressive man is what the text says there. The contest with the Egyptian was very memorable, since Benaniah was armed only with a club, and while his impressive opponent possessed a spear in his hand. And since no canonical accounts describe an encounter between Israel and Egypt during David's administration, it's possible that the Egyptian was a mercenary soldier fighting with one of Israel's enemies. Perhaps he had contracted himself out to fight against Israel with one of their enemies. Because throughout David's life, we are not aware of any conflict between Israel and Egypt. So, though this man was great, he was not included among the three. It says in verse 23, he was as famous as they were, and honored among the 30. So no doubt because of Benaniah's skill and bravery, but perhaps also because of his priestly devotion to the Lord, David put him in charge of his bodyguard. There was the Kerethites and the Pelethites. You might remember those odd names coming out way back in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel. These guys were mentioned. And when David had to flee from Jerusalem, from Absalom, there were these people that followed him, his personal guard. Well, as it turns out, Benaniah was in charge of all of these people, the guard, the palace guard. That was his reward for being the soldier that he was, for his devotion and his skill. God blessed him greatly. David desired that Benaniah be close to him. I want you watching my back. I want to be able to sleep at night and not be concerned about someone coming through my door necessarily, or attacking Jerusalem in some surprise attack. And so that was a great honor for Benaniah. That was a high responsibility that he had. So this guy is nothing to, so to speak, shake a stick at. It's not as though that the top three guys are the top three guys and everybody else is just kind of No, everybody's good here. Everybody's good, really good. Because while you have 37 men or so, depending on how you look at it, but not only, beyond these 37 men here, there are thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of other men who never made this. Never made the cut, never made this level. Obviously, David had some sort of criteria that he had made, and he gathered guys around him throughout his life, most of his life, since he went on the status of a public figure. So David's decision to use a Levite as a leader of those most directly responsible for his personal safety is a measure of degree of cooperation that existed between the king and the priesthood at that time. You might remember that David and Samuel were good friends, and that relationship between David and the priesthood was pretty close. You remember there were sons of the priests. They were priests that traveled with David while Saul was chasing him. And he would turn to the priests and he would say, "Inquire of the Lord and find out if we should pursue them or if we should not pursue them." Or even David would inquire of the Lord himself. But there was a close relationship between the priesthood and himself. And that's in contrast with Saul. Remember, Saul killed the 85 priests at Nob. David found safety and found refreshment supplies from those same priests, which Saul came around to later and murdered 85 of them. So this man, Benaiah, struck down 2 of Moab's fiercest men. He went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion, and he struck down a huge Egyptian, although the Egyptian had a spear and he only had a club. Pretty high achievements there. Significantly, we do not read about any jealousy or bitterness among any of David's mighty men. And these were men. They were not gods, of course. They were men. They had to exercise self-control. God had to enable them to be what they were. But we do not read about any jealousy or bitterness among any of these men. There must, as we've noted, there must have been criteria by which David ranked and placed these men. But we should recognize here that they were not after personal fame. These guys saw in David a man anointed, a man after God's own heart, and they desired to be. We're with David. When we're with David, we're with God's anointed. And I can't think of any place I would rather be than with God's anointed. Now the Jews thought that way about the land of Israel. The land of Israel is the promised land. The land of Israel is the land flowing with milk and honey. This is the land in which God will bless you. So to be carted out of the land is to be one of the worst things that could happen to them, because there's no blessings promised outside of the land. There's all the blessings promised inside of the land. So the one place the Jew would rather be than any place else is in the promised land. So carting them off to Babylon and scattering them all over the world was one of their worst fears. Because there's no blessings anywhere else. But there is blessings at Zion, in Jerusalem, in Israel. So they had great faith in their king and in their God. And wherever they were placed was God's decision, whether they were part of the 3 or part of a secondary group or part of another larger group. Wherever they were placed by God, it was his decision, and they believed that their king was not acting merely political in his decisions. Well, David, why did you appoint him over here, and I've done so much more, and you appointed me here with this other group? As far as we know, there was none of that. They had a great trust that their God was working through their king, and that David was not merely political in his decisions. You can have the same assurance as well. You, sitting in the pew, can have that same assurance. God has placed you precisely where you need to be for his greater glory. Bloom where you're planted, is another little saying. Always looking for greener pastures, so to speak. God's landed you here, and his good providence, flourish. Start blooming somewhere. So let's move on to verses 24 through 39. Verses 24 through 39, there are at least 31 individuals that are mentioned in this section. And the actual number depends on how verses 32 and 33 are treated. Sometimes it's difficult to understand, is this a son of someone or is this another man altogether? But it's not it's not a knock. It's not an integrity issue with the text, not by any means. But sometimes it's difficult to see because the word son is not always used. And so there are at least 31 individuals mentioned in this section. The list begins and ends with individuals known to have died on the battlefield. Asahel, we mentioned him before in verse 24. Abner killed him long before, or at least before David became king of all Israel. And the last one listed is one that you've recently heard, Uriah the Hittite. You know who he was? That was Bathsheba's husband. David is the architect of his death. David did not do it firsthand. He was, however, the architect of his death. And so David was guilty, very guilty. So the list begins with individuals known to have died on the battlefield. There are a lot of different men listed here. It says Asahel, the brother of Joab, was among the 30. Elhanan, the son of Dodo of Bethlehem. Shammah, the Hardonite. And it goes on and on and on. And there's not much given about the men. There's some son of, who their father was, but it's just a list of names from this point. And you see all of those. And if you really want to work on your English pronunciation, just pull this out and see if you can go through it. Because it will be a challenge. But what we can do from these, what we do know some about these men, is where they're from. Most of these men are from Judah, which really shouldn't surprise us. David is from Judah. David ruled over Judah 7.5 years longer than he ruled over the northern kingdoms. And so he has a longer track record. It's his home. He knows people there. There's been an opportunity for people in Judah to be faithful and stay with him for a longer period of time. So a lot of these men are going to be from Judah. There was a certain tribal pride, not in a bad sense, but every unit, so to speak, in the military, every unit has their unit flag. And you'll look on the unit flag and it has ribbons, which commemorate battles, that this unit fought in the battle of this, and there's a ribbon. And this unit fought in the battle of this, and there's another ribbon. Well, the tribe of Judah has their battle flag, and they have lots of ribbons up there. So it shouldn't be surprising to us, nor should we think of it as politically motivated on David's part to have most of his men from the tribe of Judah themselves. So a study of the cities of origin for these individuals suggests that the majority of the 30, and that's perhaps all but 12, were men from Judah. And as we said, it's not surprising because David was from Judah himself. The tensions that existed between Judah and the other tribes, remember that goes all the way back to Saul. Remember Saul was from Benjamin. Saul was king. And then when there was people who accused David of trying to usurp Saul, David kept saying, I'm not trying, Saul, I'm not trying to kill you. I'm not trying to take your throne. Saul was God's anointed. David would not kill him. So these tribal conflicts go way back. In fact, Amasa, whom Joab killed, Amasa was from Benjamin. And it's probably an attempt by David in appointing Amasa over his military. It's probably an attempt by David to convey his willingness to work with and embrace the tribe of Benjamins and the northern tribes. Because at that time, you remember in our study, some of the northern tribes were accusing the people from Judah as wanting David to do certain things, and the northern tribes were saying, but we have a part. Remember, we have a part in David as well. There are 10 tribes up here and 2 tribes down here. So this goes back a little ways. But it shouldn't surprise us, David's tribal affiliation and the tensions that existed between Judah and the other tribes. Of the non-Israelites from Judah, those that were not from Judah, among the 30, at least 3 of them, excuse me, at least 3 of them are from the tribe of Benjamin. In verse 27, it mentions the name Abiezer, Abiezer. Abiezer is from the tribe of Benjamin. In verse 29, Ithai, the son of Ribai from Gibeah in Benjamin, he's another one. And in verse 37, there's one way down in verse 37. In verse 37, Nahari, the Beerothite. was from the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Saul was from Benjamin. So among the 12 that are probably not from the tribe of Judah, 3 of those 12 are from the tribe of Benjamin. 2 others may have come from Manasseh. In verse 25, it says Shammah the Harodite and Elikah the Harodite, verse 25, and another 2 from Ephraim, Benaniah the Pirathonite, and Hediah from the ravines of Gaash. That's in verse 30. So of the 12 that are not from Judah, 3 are probably from Benjamin, 2 from Manasseh, and another 2 from Ephraim. One other one, look at verse 34. Verse 34, it says, Eliphalet, the son of Ahashbai, the son of the Maacharathite. That individual right there may have come from the tribe of Dan. And again, how we know is we look and see if we can find these cities. Where are these cities located? Located in the tribe of Dan? Is it located in the tribe of Ephraim? Different things like that. So from a study of the where the cities are, we can have some confidence that of the 12 that were not from Judah, a couple from Ephraim, a couple from Manasseh, maybe 1 from the territory of Dan, 3 from Benjamin, this group of men that were put together. Verse 36, the son of the Gadite, verse 36, may have come from the tribe of Gad. Just a few little details of these guys. In verse 31, we're looking at the first name there. It's Abialban. That's how you say that. Abialban. Abialban. That name means my father is overpowering. And there's another one in verse 31. The next name there is Azmaveth, the Barhumite. You might remember that city, Bahurim, is a place in the territory of Benjamin on the Mount of Olives. You remember this guy by the name of Shimei who kicked dirt on David as they were leaving Jerusalem. Remember that? Threw rocks on him and were cursing him. That's where this mighty man is from the same town as Shimei was. And David's men found refuge here from Saul. Bahurim is a place in the territory of Benjamin on the Mount of Olives, as we said. But David's men found refuge there in 2 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 18. And one other little detail, verse 37. Verse 37, Zelek, the Ammonite. If you were go back to chapter 17, go back to chapter 17 of 2 Samuel in verse 27. Chapter 17, verse 27. Now remember, this is during the time when Absalom is doing his thing. David is not in Jerusalem. So in verse 27, now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the sons of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curd, sheep, and cheese of the herd for David and for those who were with him to eat, for they said the people were hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So back in chapter 23, verse 37, Zeleg, the Ammonite, Shobi, what we just read, Shobi, the son of Nahash, came from this area. He was from the Ammonites. With other allies, they brought beds and food for David and his troops. One of Joab's armor bearers, and included in the class of the mighty men, was an Ammonite. How about that? One of them was an Ammonite. He wasn't even an Israelite. And Uriah, verse 39, Uriah was a Hittite. He wasn't even an Israelite, yet he was a mighty man. Now what that should tell us is that it doesn't matter where you're from. Even in Israel, it did not matter where you're from. Rahab the harlot, the Canaanite harlot, Ruth the Moabite from Moab. If you embrace the God of Israel, then Israel, God welcomed you, and Israel was commanded to care for them and embrace them as well. There were rituals that you needed to go through in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament, God was just as much interested in the salvation of people, not just Israel, as he is in this day today. In fact, he saved a whole city called Nineveh one time. So it's good to see this. It's good to understand this. An Ammonite, a Hittite were two of David's mighty men. So in wrapping all this up, why do we have chapter 23? I mean, why is it even here? Why read this? And we can't pronounce the name. So why is it even here? Well, first of all, I think it is a very practical expression of David's character. Very practical expression of David's character. A man after God's own heart is much more than simply a holy man on Sunday or a Saturday in the temple. This is David's character here. He is a man after God's own heart. He is not just a godly man, a man on the Saturday as he worships in the tabernacle or the temple. He is much more than that. Or today, he's much more than simply a holy man on Sunday. His dealings with his men are just. He doesn't tip the scales with these guys. The scales are even, and things are weighed out according to God's good pleasure. And we're not going to help God out, and we're not going to try to hide things from God as well. So I think one of the reasons we have this in here is to see that character from David, that he does deal justly with his men. And God had already expressed this principle, and the principle is, I desire obedience over sacrifice. Remember that? 1 Samuel chapter 15. I desire obedience over sacrifice. That's David's character. Again, he was more than just a holy man on the Sabbath. He was holy, ethically, in all of his dealings with his men. And that's a man after God's own heart. Secondly, God protected David and expanded the Israelite borders through faithful men. God honored his covenant with David, and here is a testimony to God's faithfulness. The miraculous evidently was not common, and not a common occurrence in this day in which David lived, and that's fine. God works in and through ordinary faithful men and makes them great. He makes them great men. He instills in them, and he uses his tools to draw out of them the very best from them. And that's what David did. And we have here a testimony of what God said he would do for David. He began to do, and he protected David, and he did it through all of these men. It's not that these men are here to be honored or to be worshiped. They are testimony. They are statues of the tools that God used to accomplish his purpose, to stay true to his word, true to his covenant with David. These men are products of their great God. So we should not worship the men, we should worship the God who made the man. And lastly, something that we touched on last week a little bit, the Bible records these men. The Bible gives us a record of these great men for our learning. They are for our learning. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 2, or verse 4, Romans 15:4 is a passage that we can look to, and listen to what it says. For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through the perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. So you see in David's mighty men at times impossible odds, unbelievable odds, and yet they stood their ground as faithful men, and they prevailed. Now, that's not a call for us to go grab our guns and our swords and start marching on the Capitol. That's not what we're taught to do here. But we are taught to, and we are to understand that these were faithful men. They did what God called them to do. They had the blessings in the promised land. So they knew they could defend the promised land because it was God's land. It was where God would bless. It's the land flowing with milk and honey. They had the mandate to defend it and to run people out. And they stood their ground against unbelievable odds, and they were faithful. So wherever God plants you, don't give in. Be faithful. Stand your ground. Don't give ground. Live wisely. Live to the glory of your Father. Do not give ground. There's other passages. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32 and following is another long statement that you could read about. It doesn't mention any men's names, I don't think, specifically. Hebrews 11 beginning at verse 32. And what more can I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong. This whole list, it's all there. So I believe these are the reasons why God has, and I'm sure there are others. These are some of the reasons that God has included chapter 23 in Scripture. We are to be encouraged by these great men. I want to be a great man of God. That may not mean being a soldier necessarily, but I still want to be a great man of God. I want to be around people that draw out of me more than I think I can give. Otherwise, he's not worth following. Do you think anybody else is worth following? You're okay. Just keep doing what you do. You're fine. You want to follow somebody like that? I don't. That's why people move all the way across the United States to go to Grace Community Church, because they want to be there and serve with John MacArthur. Hundreds of people have done that over the years because they are drawn. He draws out of them excellence and commitment. Any questions?